Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to SwiftSlots. Now I've been a very bad boy again. I've been looking on eBay for potential slot cars and I stumbled across this. I didn't know what it was. I just thought, what an awesome vehicle. I like my off-road vehicles and this is off-road in the extreme. I absolutely love the colour, I love the shape, I love everything about it. It's cool. So quite expensive. It's a pullback and go car with lots of other features and I'll show you those in a minute. I didn't know anything about it whatsoever. So I went on YouTube to find out what it was. And apparently it's an Avtaros Shaman 8x8. It's Russian made for rescue across the tundra and deep frozen continents and stuff like that. They use them for medical rescue, adventuring and so on and so forth. And people like Supercar Blondie and Top Gear on YouTube have actually reviewed these exact vehicles in real life and they're very impressive. So I had to buy one. Really cool. So here it is. So we're going to turn this behemoth of a car into a slot car. Now I don't know how well this is going to go because this body is die cast and the whole thing is massive, but we're going to give it a try. So what I'm going to do, I'll get you on my table, we'll go through all the parts I'm going to put in this car and then we'll go to a track. Who knows what track it's going to be because this thing is huge and it can't run on Rickard Valley or Crow Valley. It's just too big. So we'll get it into a slot car and then we'll work out where we're going to run it at the end of this video. So let's get you on my table, show you the car in depth and also the parts that are going to go in it. Okay guys, feast your eyes on this. They say it's 1/24th scale. I'm not quite sure. I do know it's so big I'm almost thinking about having to move the camera up to get it into view, but look at the size of that thing. It's absolutely massive and it weighs an absolute ton. It's really cool. Let's just go around the other side and show you. Now, this thing is absolutely packed full of features and I'm going to show you them all. And there's the top. Love the colour, such a nice colour. And the underside there. Now you see we've got a switch here as well. So we've got three settings. We've got sound, lights and off. And we have a battery port in there. So let me just turn the lights on first and we'll go through the lights. So we got headlights and the top roof lights there with a light bar and the little spots on the roof as well. And on the rear we got the tail lights just there. Now I'm not sure if the camera's going to... Yeah, there we go. You can see it off my hand anyway. So obviously the camera's trying to cancel out the lights. But they're bright red in real life. You can see them glowing off my hand. Look. Really cool. Now if I turn it over to the sound, we got all sorts of sound going on. So if you open the door, we got that, and then we open up the door and the back lights are all flashing, and then if you press it down, now I'm not entirely sure that sound is correct for this vehicle because it's diesel and it only does 40 miles an hour top speed. So not sure about that one. And it's also got a pull back and go feature. So if we wind him back, you can let him go. There we are. And also that pull back and go feature is actually on two sets of wheels. So this is very difficult to show you guys because it's a little bit... So if I'm just doing on the back wheels, there. And if I do it on the front as well, you'll see those ones there. So there's two sets of driven axles. Also, all the axles have got independent, well, I suppose you call it suspension in that direction there. And also, they go up and down as well. So they are actually all independent suspension. And that's not really going to show, is it? But you can see, or you might not be able to tell, up and down, side to side and all the rest of it. So what we got, other features, we've got an opening roof hatch. We've got, obviously, if you've seen the opening doors, we've got sliding side mirrors, or side windows, sorry, there and there. We've got an opening tailgate. We've also got a removable roof, and I'll show you that when we go to the bench because it's a little bit tricky to get off on the table here. And then we've got an opening bonnet with an engine. Look at that. It's so cool. Really like this car. So that's basically the car in its detail, roughly. There'll be a bit more detail to show you when I pull it apart as well. There's a little bit of internal detail as well, which is really quite nice. So that's the truck in its entirety. Oh, it's got pneumatic tyres as well. Actually, I say they're pneumatic. They're quite hard, actually. No, I take that back. These tyres are quite hard. So we might have to put a bit of varnish on the front tyres. So we're going to have a bar, a drop arm, coming from the middle of the underbelly forwards to about here. And then we're going to drive it on 2 axles. So, having said that, let's just show you. I'm going to put it there because it's so huge it's going to take up most of the camera. So there we are. So let me show you the parts that I've got to go in it. Now first of all, let me show you the driver. So it's a Russian vehicle, so I think it's only fitting that we should fit a Russian driver in all his cold weather gear, because that seems appropriate for this car. Now I've had this car, this driver printed, sorry. The guy is called Scotty's Slot Car Customs. Now he hasn't really got much of a website going at the moment, only really a Facebook page, but he has got a lot of projects up his sleeve and he's been into slot cars forever. So he's a really good guy to know for slot cars, but not very well known yet. But we'll try and help that along by making him a bit more well known. So go and have a look at his Facebook page and give him a shout on his Facebook page. Let him know that you're there, guys. Give him a shout and tell him that you're around, and then give him a bit of sort of a boost, and then maybe we can jeer him on to sort of get going with a lot more slot car stuff as well. So anyway, this is a 3D printed man that he's done for me. It was a custom file we pulled off the internet and he's printed it off for me, done a really good job. I'm very, very happy with the driver. So that is our driver. Okay, so I did say that this car is going to be powered by 2 motors, and here they are. Now they're Pendle Slot Racing 20k long can motors, and I've gone for a long can for the torque, and 20k should be more than enough speed to gear it down to get enough torque to get this thing to move. So these are very good motors. I've used them on lots of different projects before, especially in the 1/24th scale cars, and they work really, really well. They're not overly speedy, but if you want something that's got torque and a really decent turn of speed that's manageable, these 20k motors are absolutely perfect for that, and they're very, very strong. So there are our twin motors. And we're going to need a pinion for those motors, so I've gone for a slotted 10-tooth pinion, again from Pendle Slot Racing, part number P160100, and they come in a twin pack, so I've only got to buy 1 pack, which is very, very handy. And to power the 2 axles, I've gone for the slotted spur gears, and they are 38 tooth, and they are part number GS1938. So they should do the job reasonably well. So between these gears and the pinions, I should get a gear ratio of 3.8 to 1, which hopefully will be about right. Now the guide, I'm going to change direction here ever so slightly, because this is a big vehicle and I wanted a big guide. Now I normally go for the Slotting Plus guides, as you know, but this is a big vehicle and I want a big guide in it. So I've gone for this 3/16 Scale Auto guide. Now it's actually bigger than the normal Slotting Plus one that I use, and that's going to be the problem. What track can I find that'll take this 9mm deep guide? So yeah, might be a problem that, but we'll worry about that when we get to it. In a worst case scenario, I can always swap one of these out for a standard Slotting Plus 7mm guide, and then we'll just have to sort of drive the car around very, very carefully and hope it doesn't fall out of the slot. And then, as you heard, this truck has got all the sounds, and I do want to run this car around with all its lights on when it's going around the track. I'm not going to be able to get the sounds working all the time because the sounds are just momentary, so I won't bother with the sounds, but I do want the lights, and they're going to be quite power hungry over a period of time. So I'm going to use this AAA 3-cell holder, and I'm going to implant that into the chassis so that we can keep those lights on for a prolonged period of time. So we got a standard AAA battery holder as well. So there we are. That's all the parts for this car. So now I guess all we got to do now is go over to the bench, probably have to reinforce the bench and start working on getting this car pulled apart and getting all this lot in it, and then we'll go and find a track to run her on. Okay, so here we go. Let's try and work out how on earth I'm going to power up this truck. But first of all, let me show you how to take this back end off. I've actually worked it out. It's quite easy, really. You slide it back. And there we are. So there's the actual roof cab back, and then this is the interior here. So you got some nice seating in there and a little bit of a checkered floor pattern, and you can see into the back of the truck there, or maybe you can't, but there we are. Right, so that's the back removed. So let's get this whole thing off, undo all these screws and see where we're at. So here we are. So now we can see some of the internals that we're dealing with here. Oh, there we go, I can do it that way. So here we got our friction motors here, speaker, LEDs, obviously a little board to work out where our electrics are going, and another sub chassis. So as you can see, we've got plenty of room once we remove this stuff up here to put a spare battery for the power. So let's keep going and see what we got. And there we are. So that's it. So we're in. So we can see the little seat here as well where our driver would sit. And also in the front of the cab, we've also got a nice, I don't know if I can show you. This is awkward, isn't it? Show you a little bit of detail. I don't know if any of this is coming through. Maybe it's not. Bang the camera there. So you got a little bit of detail there with the steering wheel and all the clocks. So, and our little driver, he fits in our seat just there, and it fits absolutely perfectly. I will need to just trim a little bit of his legs down, but you can't really see much of him when the whole truck's together anyway. We've got a bulkhead there that we'll need to trim as well, just to sort of clear his legs. But I do actually want to leave all of these working sound features on this car when it's finished as a slot car. So I don't really want to be removing any of these LEDs. We just cut the man around it to get it all working. So let's see now if I can remove this board and the speaker and the LEDs to try and get this chassis sort of liberated. Well, there we are. It wasn't too painful, and all those electrics either screwed in or pushed in, so I didn't have to break anything to get anything out. Now we can see how all the suspension works. So we've got a spring in the middle of this H frame here, and that is basically how it all works. So by the time I've removed this friction motor here, we should be able to get the batteries in there somehow, maybe. And we can take out that pod there. Actually, it might be able to go in this middle here. So that might be a way of doing it, actually. If we might be able to get, yeah, we will be able to get the, once this battery pod here is gone, the speaker's low profile anyway, so this new battery holder can sink down in there because this friction motor will be going, so that'll free up a little bit more room in the front there. So that's basically where we're starting from. Now we need to work out where we're going to fit the motor. Right, okay, let's take these friction motors out and then maybe get some wheels off, and then we'll see where we're at then. Okay, so that all got very brutal, didn't it? But we're here now, we're on the other side of most of the wrecking work. So all I've done is I've just taken out the friction motors and the gearing off the axles. I've also reduced down this battery, but the old battery box now, because we don't need that, because that has now created lots of nice room for the new one. So that's all pretty good. And as you saw, I managed to pull these wheels off. I was a little bit worried because some of these toys can have really vicious knurling on the end of these wheels. Sometimes it's really hard to get the axles off, but these come off without too much problem. But also now we've got excessive side flow in these axles here. So now I know I can pull the wheels off at the end of the build, or close to the end of the build. I can measure the distance on either side, pull these wheels off, and then put in some brass spacers on the ends of those axles to limit all that side flow, and that might be quite helpful. I'll leave a little bit actually, because it's so long, a little bit of side flow might be useful, but we don't want that much. So now we're at this point, I'm going to now do something that I've not actually tested at all in this whole project, and that is to find out what our axle sizes are. So what are we going to have to do with this? Oh, brilliant. Excellent. Right. These shafts are too big, which means all I've got to do is ream the hole out on that gear, which is fantastic. That saves me a lot of work. So what are we dealing with? Are these 3mm axles or what? Let me just have a look. Let's see now. Zero that up. 2.5. Right, okay, well I should be able to ream it out to 2.5 fairly easily. Right, so we're going to leave it there for a minute. I'm going to have my dinner. I'm going to think about what I'm going to do, and then we'll come back and do the next bit. Okay, so I've had my dinner and I've had a sleep. And that's the thing about this sort of project. you really should take your time to try and work out all the different iterations of how you could go about solving a problem. And that's the bit that I like about this hobby the most, is how to solve problems. And the reason why I do a lot of what I do here and not just buy parts off the shelf, because it's more fun to make them and think about solutions than it is to just buy parts. Not that you could buy parts for this anyway, but you get my point. So give yourself some time to think. If you're wondering what to do with a project, just stop and think. And that's the best way to go forward. So I've done that. I've had a think. As you can see, or as you may not have noticed, there's 2 knurled axles up the front end now, because I've taken each of those and then put this smooth axles on the back, or will be on the back, and I put the knurled ones on the front because they don't do a great deal, because I have a plan for the back end and it doesn't include those knurlings. So what we're going to do, we're going to tackle the suspension first. Now here is the original H-beam for this original toy, and it works on actually flexing those 2 bars physically within the plastic to get the independent side-by-side movement, and I need to replicate that. But I can't use this particular piece of plastic because I can't use all this thickness here, and you'll see why later on. So I need to make that thinner, and that's not going to work with plastic. Also, you'll notice, or you might notice actually, there's a crack in that tube just there. Now that was what was there in the toy. It's only a toy, it doesn't matter. So what happens is this H bar goes over the top, and then the spring over the top of that, and so on. So this crack has formed because the screw was being wedged into it. So what we need to do is replace that post for a brass one. So I've got a piece of brass here. I'm simply going to put an M2.5mm thread on the top and the bottom, grind away that, pop him in place, put a thread in there and bolt him in place, because that is basically exactly the same size as that post there. So that's what I'm going to do for that. Now this H pattern, I've given it a lot of thought. I thought about using L bracket and or L angle and all the rest of it. In the end, what I've done is I've prepared these 3 pieces of brass. So I've got a nice chunk of brass there, about 8mm by 6mm, and I've got 2 pieces here. They're about 8mm high by about 2mm thick. So they are going to go there and there, and then this crossbar will go across there like that. And what I will do is I will machine that down nice and flat, and then drill 2 M3 threads in either end, and then a 4mm hole in the middle. Obviously the post will go through the middle there, and it will be threaded. And then the bars on the sides here, they will need to be scalloped slightly at a later point. And then I should drill a hole directly in the middle, and then with these countersink M3 Allen bolts, and I will chop the threads down, I will put those in to the sides like that, and they will go into this block like that, and that will then give me loads of strength in these. It'll also give me the ability to independently rotate the suspension arms exactly the same as the plastic one does, only this time there'll be no flexing. It's actually done mechanically. And the reason why I'm going to use countersinks is because it's not ideal to pivot on a thread. Not that I think we're going to be really pivoting on a thread anyway in this scenario. There's so little movement, it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to use the countersinks because I can actually countersink these pieces, and you can snug up that countersink to the point at which it's just causing a tiny bit of resistance, but all the bearing surface will be on that flat side, not actually bearing down on thread. If I was to use ordinary dome head bolts, then all the pivoting would happen on those threads, and then I'd have to put a bush in there, and then it's just a load of hassle that I can't be bothered to do. And it's not really needed, because when you flex that wheel, one wheel on its own, there's so little movement there that it's not really doing much rotation here anyway. So it doesn't need a huge engineering scenario with a ball race or any other nonsense like that. This is adequate. So what we'll do is we'll get this lot here turned into a nice H section for the suspension on the front end there, and then once we got the suspension all working, then we'll move on to fitting the motors to the actual axles, and I've got a plan for that as well. Okay, so we got suspension again. Now I've only pushed these wheels in very loosely just to show you what's going on here. You can now see that we've now got suspension this way, and we've got suspension that way, and then we've got the suspension that rocks independently this way, and it all acts on these rotating pivots on the inside. And you can see, hopefully, if I show there, you can see it all moving up and down nice and smoothly, and we've got all of the action that we need. So the suspension is done. So that now really only leaves fitting the motors and the guide. So let's think about getting the motors in now. Okay, so the gearboxes are done, and I hope you followed along with me. All I did, as you saw, was just make two end plates, and the one on this end is screwed in, and the one on this end is just a friction fit on the end of the motor. And I made these two longitudinal bars with a hole in each corner, pushed them through, pulled the plates tight, and then soldered them in each corner. And I put a pair of bearings in the bottom, this one halfway because of the layout of the chassis, and this one all the way inboard because the gear is going on this end, but it is actually flush to the end of that plate. And the way they work is simply you pop the gear onto the axle, which has now been reamed to 2.5mm, and I've filed away the knurlings on the end of the shaft. There's still plenty of knurlings there to be able to glue the wheel back on. and you simply slide the whole assembly straight into the wheel there, and then when we put power to it, look at that, no problem at all, super smooth. So if we look at it from the underside, there you go, that should do the job really well. And as you saw, I've made two, so I've got one for this one as well. So there we are. So now we've actually got our power units done. Now I guess we just need to fit them to the chassis. Okay, so there are a handful of little mini jobs on this chassis in order to get the motors in and the suspension all buttoned up and finished. One of those little mini jobs is to scallop the ends of these brass arms so that one fits in that gap in there, and the other just make sure it clears the end of that motor. Also then, I'm going to put some thread lock on these threads with a little bit of grease in between that screw head and this main bar. And then that means that I can then drop this in and it can slide into this motor pod easily. Okay, so I've adjusted the suspension now so it all fits the car and runs really well, and I put some really thick silicone grease behind that screw head so that makes that buttery smooth on both sides and there is no slop at all in any of those parts. And also put some really strong thread lock inside those threads so that those screws cannot back out at all. And I've just thinned out the bottoms of these arms here so that they clear the back of the motor, wrong one, this side, just so they clear everything on the back there. And also I thinned out this arm here so that it fits underneath there, right on top of that bearing. And I did also add this piece of piano wire across the bottom of this arm because I didn't honestly realize just how thin that arm was going to have to be to get underneath this motor. But as you can see now, it fits underneath there absolutely fine. And also the back arm is just canting just a little bit just to make sure that it lands squarely on top of that bearing. And also a little disclaimer, I did actually have to replace this tube for one that was 3mm longer because it didn't quite reach that arm when it was all in place after I checked it. So a little mistake, but that's all corrected. So that is the suspension all finished on the back. And as I said before, with this rear one, when I had it, it actually had broken on the back of this truck. But also, if you look at the front, it's also broken on the front as well. So before I call this suspension done, I think what I'm going to do is make another post on the front here, exactly the same as I did on the back, because this front one snapped as well. I'm not going to replace the H-frame, just going to replace the brass turret or the plastic turret for a brass one, and that'll be good for that. So I won't do that on camera, I'll do that now, and then we can move on to the next stage of finding out these pods down the side here, or these gaps down the side, so that this motor pod can slide in, because the side of the chassis is going to be the thing that governs the vertical movement of this motor, which is why this plate had to be thinner than the actual motor and why these bars had to be tucked right underneath this motor so that the side doesn't interfere with any of it, because the chassis itself is going to be what controls that motor up and down movement. So let's crack on. I'll make this post and we'll start filing out the chassis to get these motors in. Okay, so here we are, more or less at the end of the chassis construction stage. So after this stage, we've just got the front guide to fit and then get the body all back on, trimming it where needed. However, I'll talk you through this quickly before we fast forward and get it all assembled. So here is the new brass post I made to hold the old H pattern suspension. So that's been replaced. These little brass triangles here are actually going to go in the bottom of these little sections just here. I'm going to glue them in. So basically what will happen is that they will space the actual axle off the base of the chassis by the same amount as these brass bushes or bearings do up the drive end, because what's happening is, because these bushes are thicker than where the axle used to sit, it's lifted the rear axles. So the wall thickness on those tubes is 0.75 mil, and so are these brass shims here. So if I put 0.75 mil on the base there, that'll lift the front end as well, and that will keep the chassis all nice and level. So that's those. Now these little collars here that I've made, they've got a little drive dog in there to stop them from rotating. So I've worked out that I need about 2.8 mil of spacers on all corners to stop the end float from being excessive, because it's all governed by the drive side of the drivetrain and how thick that is there. So it turns out to be about 2.8 mil of spacers everywhere else. So these are the 2.5 mil spacers, 2.8 mil, and the little drive dog on there is to stop these bearings from rotating, because rather than trying to work out what packer I need on this side to balance up the side where the bearing sits, it's easier to just basically make a bearing on this side and also incorporate the bearing into the spacer. But I don't really want this whole thing here rotating, because that is effectively going to be rubbing on the bottom of the chassis. So by putting a little drive dog in there, that stops it from rotating, but also still allows it to have the suspension, but also gives the right packing of the axle off the bottom of the chassis. So that's what those little drive dogs are for. And also I've modified the suspension a little bit, and I put these kind of, I don't know, keeps or brackets on the end, because what I was finding was that those little arms on there that used to sit on the top of those bearings would fall off, because when that groove there locates into this bearing, as it gets to a certain height, it was allowing the whole thing to rotate backwards like that, and it didn't take a lot of movement for that to do that. So what I ended up doing was making these little keeps and soldering them on. They're only 0.5 mil nickel silver, and they're fitted on very, very precisely, and all that happens is that slides on there like that, and then that still allows it all to move, but it just holds that bearing in place as the suspension's working up and down, and it doesn't allow it to fall out of that little keep. The top of the motor is still being guided by the chassis. That's not the problem, that's plenty, but as it gets to there, you see, it can fall out the bearing. So those little keeps stop that from happening. So I think that's basically everything. Oh, I've reduced down these wheels because the spacer that goes in there or requires it, because of the gearing and all the rest of it. The back-to-backs, this all, or the distance between the bearings, it's all worked out, so that's just what that needs to be. So really that's about it. So then I'm going to glue these in, with a bit of epoxy, and I put these little notches in the side because I want the epoxy to squeeze up the side, come around those little notches, and those little notches will help lock these little packers into their little triangles where they live, and that will just keep them all in place nicely. So let's fast forward, let's get these glued in, let's bolt everything back together again. I'm going to leave out this middle axle here because we're going to put a guide in there next, and we'll get everything else back up on its wheels. Okay, starting to feel like progress now. So here is the chassis all assembled, all bar this fourth set of wheels here, which I need to get behind to fit the guide, so they're off for a minute. You can see the little brass packers down there, just keeping the front wheels off the chassis by the same amount as the rear bearings. So you can see nice and smooth and all very free floating. The suspension is all back in and working. Rear motors with all the suspension in as well. And you can see all the suspension all working there, absolutely fine. And then the front axle there, all working absolutely fine. And if we put power to it, it goes like this. Absolutely joyous. These gears and these motors run really well. That is a really smooth sound. I'm very happy with how this has turned out. It's always a bit of a worry with these projects because there's so many variables and they're so different, all sorts of engineering problems and solutions to overcome. And when it all just works exactly like that, it's really nice. So it's all in now. You can see all the spacers are all in there as well, all spacing, and the distances between these wheels here are all exactly the same because I had to remove a little bit of back of the wheel off of this wheel for the gears. That governed my spacing here, which then I was able to translate around all the other 6 corners. And you can see it's all working out well. That gap there is exactly the same on all of the wheels all the way through. So there we are. So that is the chassis all in and all working. So the next job now is to get behind this set of wheels here, which I've left out, because I'm going to put the drop arm in about here, just hidden behind the tyre, and it'll come down from some bushes down to the front and obviously back again. And I've got this really heavy piece of, it's not brass, I think it's bronze rod. It's really quite stiff. It's just as solderable and bendable and workable as brass. It's a little bit harder, but that's the point. It is a little bit harder, so it'll really take a bit more abuse. It's a little bit better than brass, a little bit more heavy duty. So I think it's bronze rod, and this is about 2.5 mil, so it's good and sturdy. So we're going to come down from here on a bit of a cranked arm and then over to the front, and I'm going to put a cam in here, a little tiny spring and an arm, just to sort of give it a little bit of spring on the inside, but you won't see it on the outside. So let's get on, let's make some bearings to go in here, and let's get this rod all bent up into something looking like a guide. But there it is, the entire chassis entirely finished. Now I didn't actually record every single little step of this because some of it's quite mundane and some of it was quite tricky, but it's all done now, so I'll walk you through it and show you kind of what I've done. So I revisited the bending of these bars just to tuck them in a little bit more, make them a little bit tighter, and then fixed them all in place, and then I glued my guide holder on after I'd made it. Got it all working well. Just pushed those bars straight in because all the force is coming from the front, so a bit of epoxy in those holes. They go in 10mm, more than strong enough, that's never coming off. And I made these little brackets here just to hold the wire so they don't all move. And what else have I done? It's just a little bit of 24 gauge silicone wire, and you can see it's all working there. And these are special braids. I think they came from Carrera actually, so they're not that special, but they actually fit this Scale Auto guide quite well, and I just soldered down through the holes to solder in the wire. So I don't think they're quite the right braids, but they work perfectly well with the little brass little clasps on the back of them that force in, so they're actually perfectly good. And say this is a 9mm guide. Hopefully I can keep the 9mm guide and it'll be all right for where I want to run the car. And as you can see, I've put this fourth axle in along with the relevant spacers, and that's all happy in there now. And as you can see, I'm trying to keep that guide down to show you, because on the other side I fitted this brass, or made and fitted this brass retaining collar. It's a little bit wonky because of the arm that comes through the bulkhead here isn't quite square, but it all works perfectly, so I went with it rather than trying to mess around with it even more. You know, it works, it's fine, you'll never see that again. You know, let's move on. So over the other side here, you will see the mechanism that's keeping my guide wanting to go down, and that's that little lever in there. So it's really only just a bush with an extra arm on it, and I've got a brass rivet or a copper rivet here that limits the movement going upwards basically. And then obviously I've got my extension screw, my spring here, hooked over another rivet with a little tiny groove notched in it, just so that spring can't pop out. And you can see that's putting on some really nice tension. It kind of wants to spring against all this weight when it's upside down, but you can really see it working well there. So it's really super smooth, and the whole assembly is absolutely solid but completely free to move. So if you want to adjust the height of that guide to lift or lower the front end to get it to ride on the guide, or to set the front axle basically, all you need to do is undo that grub screw there and position the guide where you want it and lock it back up, because as the guide comes to rest this way, it actually rests against this post. By adjusting the angle of this little arm here, you can adjust the position of that front guide. As simple as that really. And then the spring has got constant tension on it, and there'll be plenty, because you'll only be adjusting this by absolute fractions. Doesn't affect the spring at all. So there we are. So that is the whole chassis basically completely finished and ready to go. So oh, look at this, I'm comically putting it on the setup plate. What's the point in that really? Anyway, so what we've got to do now is try and get this chassis back on, so this body or the sub chassis back onto the chassis. I have to cut some slots in there to get the motor to clear, and I think that's about it. I've removed these lugs off the back here. I'm pretty sure that's almost all I need to do to this, and then I've got to try and get this board actually relocated into the front section here. So I'm going to make an up and over resin piece in there with a slot in it, which is sandwiched between the bottom of the chassis and that button, and then there'll be a slot in it so that when this front axle gets completely bottomed out, it'll actually push the resin block and push it against that button, so I'll still get those ridiculous racing sounds. And I'll cut a slot in the front here to put that switch poking through, and that's going to be a bit of a fiddle because there's nowhere really to put that. I'm going to have to just notch it around that post as well, so that's going to be a bit of a fiddle. And there'll be some wires here that I'm going to have to extend as well, and also the battery holder that is going to go here, and there's plenty of room for it. I say plenty of room, but there's room for it, no problem at all, but that'll just need wiring in. And then last of all, I can paint my man to go in the front of the truck, and I've already cut away the front of the truck here to make him fit, and I've test fitted him. He's a little bit of a snug fit behind the steering wheel of the car, but he actually fits perfectly well. So I won't film any of this next stage. I'll do a little bit of the man and I'll put the lid on and then we'll go straight to the track, and I have secured a place to run the car. And there you are, that's the completion of my toy die-cast 1/24 scale 8x8 Shaman, and I think the project has gone quite well. Now, the track that I ran it on was not designed for something this big and this awkward to get round the corners, but that said, it still ran round the track pretty well. I had a couple of other club members play with it as well, and they seemed to enjoy it. It had reasonable top speed, reasonable braking, and it seemed to handle reasonably well. You can go around the corners quite briskly, and the back axles didn't fight each other as much as I thought they might, and the front wheels didn't pose that much of a problem going around the corner with all that resistance. I thought that might be a problem as well, but no, it all seems to work reasonably well. I'm very pleased with the way it runs, considering it's so huge. And for those that are wondering, I've just weighed it and it's 665 grams. It's absolutely massively heavy. For a slot car, it's almost unfeasible, but it seems to have worked out. Now, that's what I like about these projects. On the face of it, it didn't seem too difficult, and it's quite a big model, so there's a lot of space, but when you actually get down to the nitty gritty of it, it takes quite a lot of thinking. It's quite a lot of a cognitive exercise to get something like this actually working with all the features. And talking of features, yes, I absolutely did manage to retain the sound. Oh, it's trying to go off already. So there we are, all done. We'll wait until this turned off. Hang on, let me turn it up. There you go. So I hope that you've enjoyed this content, and I hope it's given you some inspiration to look at something that maybe shouldn't be a slot car and turn it into a slot car. Just take your time and think about what you're going to do and plan the route ahead, and just think ahead a few steps and take it slowly, step by step. And something this complicated isn't quite so bad when you take baby steps. So I hope that you've enjoyed this content, and if you have, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you could hit the little bell button, that would be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.